Welcome to another session with Explore the Bible series, small group session today. If you have your Bible with you, turn to Romans 13, and we'll be looking at that entire chapter today. And I think it's appropriate that we are taking time to look at chapter 13. Of course, Paul is talking about or addressing the issue of us. Or our relationship to our government, our elected officials, and so we could we want to follow this theme today of our relationship to the state as good citizens. Okay, and so we want to take a look at that. Before we get to this point, Paul has been focusing on believers, say, within the community of faith, and now he is taking a look at, or he is focusing our attention on how we are to relate to those outside the church. And according to Warren Wiersbe, he declares that God has established three institutions. The first one being the home, we find in Genesis 2:18 through 25, with the first couple coming together in marriage and beginning a family. Secondly is the government. We can find the rudimentary beginnings of a government in Genesis chapter 9, 1 through 17. The covenant that God made with Noah after the flood was over, how he put certain things into play, I suppose you could say, about how to govern relationships, and then of course over time that has grown to be something much bigger. And a third institution that Wiersbe states that God has created or established is the church, and we found that in Acts 2 as Peter's preaching at Pentecost, and the beginning of a more organized kind of assembly that we know as the church. You know, persecution had not yet hit. There would be two persecutions that would just be detrimental under the reign of Nero and under the reign of Domitian, that would really test the faith of any Christian. So Paul knew that there would be a time when persecution would come. It had not yet come, but it was going to become, and when that day would come, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for believers to be loyal to the emperor. They wouldn't be able to burn incense. They wouldn't be able to bow and say Caesar's Lord. They wouldn't be able to do these things. So it would cost them greatly in many different ways. And I'm going to just follow Wiersbe's outline to some degree. So I hope if you do have a copy of the Explore Bible series book, you can read that as a supplement, I guess you could say, to what I'd like to share with you. He gives some good thoughts today. And the first, and what we want to base our study on today is that Wiersbe says that Paul gives us four reasons for the Christian to yield to the laws of the state. Okay, and we all know that there may be times when we can't do that. Some legislation that has been put into place in the last few years, Supreme Court rulings in certain areas of family life, marriage, marital statuses, and things like that. We know as believers we can't adhere to that, and so we still live in a country that we have to somehow in some way live within those bounds, but yet our obedience to God is first and foremost. So the first thing, or the first reason, is that government is God's servant for our good in verses 1 through 4. Let me read verses 1 through 4 for us. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version today. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is a servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer." Most rulers, most people in authority would not even give a second thought the fact that God has ordained them to be in that place. God has put them there. The authority they have to rule comes from God. And many wouldn't even consider that. But for us as believers, by resisting the law is to resist God, is what Paul is saying to us in this passage. And even though we may not respect the man or woman who's in a particular office or position of authority, we still need to respect the office. Whether we respect the person, whether we believe in what they, the agenda that they are pushing, we still need to respect them. And sometimes that's not easy to do. But Paul is basically commanding us or exhorting us, giving us strong encouragement to do these kinds of things. And due to our sinfulness, God knew we needed someone in authority over us, that we had to have some kind of guidelines, and we call them laws, that we need to follow. I mean, if you're on the belt line, the speed limit 60 miles an hour, let's say. Well, that's not a suggestion, that's a law. And my children, as they now are young adults and both are married, they say, "Oh, we just do 10 miles an hour with the speed limit. That's not going to hurt us." Well, they're not going to stop us for that. Well, technically, we can be stopped for 1 mile an hour over. We're generally not, but we can be. So that 60 miles an hour is just an example that's not a suggestion, that's a law in that part of on the belt line. But if you go 60, I'll promise you'll just about get run over, huh? Those of you who do it on a daily basis know that better than I do. And many times, well, not many times, but at least one example that we have of Paul in Acts 16:37 is that Paul used the Roman law to protect his life on one occasion, and to even protect and further his ministry. When you look at that, he had been beaten. He'd been beaten without a trial, and then those who had given that punishment realized that Paul was a citizen. They were scared to death because that was illegal for them to do what they did to Paul, and him being a Roman citizen. And a second reason that Wiersbe gives us is that we obey rulers due to our conscience. In verses 5 through 7, let me read 5 through 7 for us. Therefore, one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due to them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, and respect to whom respect is due, and honor to whom honor is due. So we obey rulers out of our conscience. And so now Paul is moving to a higher motivation than the form of punishment. We don't obey the law just because we go 60 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour because we don't want to get a ticket. And so if we don't do it, then we know we're going to possibly get a ticket if we go faster than what the speed limit says. Just for an example. And so our motivation is not the ticket we're going to get, but it is a higher motivation of a clear conscience to know the law says this and I'm going to do it. But there's also a time that might come which says the law says this, but we answer to a higher power as believers, and a higher ruler, and that's God Himself. But in case it doesn't conflict, 70 miles an hour on the interstate doesn't conflict with any law that I know of that God has given us. So we obey that out of a clear conscience. It's always interesting to me when I travel, especially if I travel to my dad's house. People are just zooming past. They're 80, 85 miles an hour. And then when you see a police officer, you see all the red lights coming on as they're hitting the brakes. Well, I've got my cruise on about 72. Admit I do go over the speed limit a little bit, but not much. And I have a clear conscience because I know I'm trying to obey the law as close as possible, even though I'm still guilty to some extent, but I'm not doing 15 miles an hour over. So it's out of a clear conscience like that we do these things, not out of punishment. But it is, what we do have to remember is that when the laws of the government conflict with our conscience as believers, we must obey God. That's just how it is. Many justify rioting or rallies, marches, and those are okay. And even those who stand outside of abortion clinics and picket. In our land, sadly to say, abortion's legal. We can express our views as Christians that we believe life begins at conception. We can express that. And we can stand outside a certain distance and we can, protest against these. And hopefully some of those young women going in might turn and save the life of that unborn. And if they're unable to keep it, maybe put it up for adoption. Whatever. So we can't abide by that rule of abortion, and we can't stand outside and shoot the doctors as they go in either. That's illegal. That's murder. It goes against what God would have us to do. But share our belief on the corner, we're free to do that. But when it conflicts with the laws of the state, conflict with our conscience, we always answer to a higher power, and that's God Himself. And in Acts 24:16, Paul is speaking of having a clear conscience toward God and toward people, and that's what you and I need to strive for. Is that we know that we have a good conscience before others, that we have a clear conscience before God as we try to follow and do what He does, and also to be the good citizen as we can. We pay our taxes. We have our cars inspected. We pay our house payments and our insurance and things like this that are required of us. We may not like it, but we do it, and that is being a good citizen. And tax season is upon us, huh? It's already here again, but at least we have July, right, to pay what we might owe. I don't think any of us would agree 100%, no matter what side of the political spectrum we might find ourselves. But I doubt any of us would agree 100% on how the government uses our tax dollars. And so but we still give our taxes. We still pay our taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, you're committing fraud. And so we do not pay our taxes, even though we may not agree on how they are used. I sometimes wish I could designate where my tax money goes, like many of us do in the church. We designate where our money might be spent and used. But we are commanded to pay taxes and revenue. Now, these are a little bit different. Taxes would be like our state and federal taxes that we pay. And then revenue would be something like, would probably be equivalent to like paying a sales tax. So you get a double whammy. We pay taxes on what we earned, and then we pay taxes on what we buy. And so that's pretty much what I think Paul is talking about in our day and time would be equivalent somewhat to that. And then he says to give respect and honor. We're to respect and honor. If we can't respect and honor the person due to their beliefs or due to their behavior as an individual, then at least respect and honor the office, because God has established the office. When we don't do these things, pay our taxes, state this consumption tax, I suppose you'd say, or whatever, and give respect and give honor, what we're really doing is that we disrespect the law that God has put in place. And we disrespect the officials that God has ordained to be there. And most of all, we disrespect the Lord himself, because this is his law to us. And not to do these things would be a violation of our conscience as well. And a third reason that we do these things, our only debt is to love one another. We find this in verses 8 through 10. It says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments you shall not commit, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law." And so that is our only real debt. I absolutely hate debt. I remember we're living in the first and only house we've ever bought or paying off. And sitting in that lawyer's office that day, I thought I would absolutely pass out after page when he was showing us the payments for 30 years. And I was thinking, I'll be 83 years old before I pay this house off. I said, I probably won't live to see the end of this mortgage. And I found myself being physically sick and had to absolutely go outside, because I just do not like debt. But a house was a necessity when we signed that 30-year mortgage. And Jesus gave us a new commandment in John 3:34, which he said to love one another, and that is our debt. And he said, not only love one another, but love one another just as I have loved you. And Francis Schaeffer wrote these words. He says, "We cannot expect the world to believe that the Father sent the Son, that Jesus' claims are true, and that Christianity is true unless the world sees some reality of the oneness of true Christians." And folks, I just want to encourage you that the only way the world is going to see a oneness among us as Christians is that we love one another. And the word that Paul uses in this passage is agape. That is that unconditional love that God has for us and we are to have for others. It's unconditional. There's no conditions. There's no qualifiers about that. There are no limits for us loving other people. It's just full and complete acceptance of others and doing whatever we can do to help our neighbor, whatever that might be. And our motivation for helping others is the love of Christ in us. And it's not the law, but it's out of grace. It's out of grace that we love one another. You know, the Bible doesn't prohibit us owing someone money, but it does forbid us charging high interest rates. It just flies all over me in times of emergency that prices just seem to skyrocket, and people taking advantage of others, and in times when people really need help, really need others to help them during that time. Um, we don't need to get in unnecessary debt, buying things that we really don't need, and stretching our budget and stretching our income that we do have beyond what we can reasonably afford, and so we need to be careful with that. What Paul is addressing in this passage as a whole is that he is addressing a heart issue. Laws established can't change that heart, can't change our heart. Only God can do that. Only the grace of God can change our heart. You know, Jeremiah 17:9 and 10 just excerpts from that. It says, the heart is deceitful above all things. The heart is. And verse 10 reads, I the Lord, search the heart and I test the mind. So our heart's very deceitful, but God searches and he knows our heart. And so laws can't change that, only the grace of God. And then finally, the fourth reason that Wiersbe points out for us, he says we need to put on the armor of light, verses 11 through 14. Beside this, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. Let us then lay aside the work of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. And so Paul is emphasizing returning to Christ. The rally cry here that Paul is mentioning is be prepared. Be prepared, and do all of this out of love for God and for others. And he is saying that our salvation is near. Our salvation is near. It's nearer today than it was when we first believed, when we first began. It is for all of us, and many, many centuries have passed since Paul wrote this. And Warren Wiersbe remarks, he makes this statement. He says, Paul gave several admonitions in light of the Lord's soon return. Wake up, clean up, and grow up. Wake up, clean up, and grow up are the three things. When the Lord returns, we don't want to be caught living in a worldly way. We don't want to be caught off guard. We want to be living a godly life in a way that would be pleasing to Jesus, and in a way for him to find us. I suppose the way it is when we're driving, when that police officer shows up out of nowhere, we're prepared. We're doing the speed limit. We're not breaking the law. We're doing exactly what we've been asked to do. And so it is with Christ, is that we obey him and do exactly what he would want us to do, and find us doing those things when he returns. As Christian citizens, as we close today, we are to be the ideal example of what a citizen looks like. People need to look to us and say, this person pays their taxes. This person obeys the law. This person, um, is doing everything that's expected of them. And so we need to be an example of what a citizen looks like. You know, although we may not always agree on policy or political parties, I believe we can all agree on the attitude we're to have towards our elected officials, uh, whether we agree with them or not. That we can have that appreciation for them, and as we look at those who may violate and go totally against God's law and commandments, this should drive us really to our knees to pray more diligently, deliberately, and intentionally uh, for our elected officials more than ever. So let's be a good citizen, and let's do those things that are required of us. But first and foremost, let's do those things that God requires of us and be faithful to Him above all things. Hope you have a good rest of the week and look forward to being with you next week.